The last house on Sycamore Street. In the fading light of an October evening, where shadows stretched like grasping fingers across overgrown lawns, Anna Martinez stood before 1313 Sycamore Street. Her camera bag weighed heavy on her shoulder, filled with the professional equipment that had made her the most sought-after real estate photographer in 3 counties. But this assignment felt different. The Victorian mansion loomed before her, a dark sentinel against the burning sunset. It was the last house standing on a street that had once been the crown jewel of Cedar Heights, before the mysterious fire of 1987 claimed the entire neighborhood, while other lots had been cleared and redeveloped. 1313 remained, defiant and untouched, its weathered gingerbread trim and sagging shutters telling stories of forgotten grandeur. "Just get the standard package," her client had said. "Interior, exterior, nothing fancy. Demolition scheduled for next week." Simple enough, except nothing about this house was simple. Anna's Nikon D850 felt unusually cold against her hands as she raised it to capture the exterior. Through the viewfinder, she watched in disbelief as the house transformed. The peeling paint renewed itself. The dead garden bloomed with Victorian splendor. And on the wraparound porch, figures in 1920s attire laughed silently over tea. She lowered the camera. The house was decrepit again. But when she checked the photo preview, there it was, the house in its glory days, complete with ghostly tea party attendees. Her hands trembled as she pushed open the front door, its hinges protesting with a sound like a mourner's wail. The foyer smelled of dust and decay and something else, something that reminded her of her grandmother's cedar chest, where memories were stored in mothballs and yellowed photographs. In the kitchen, each photo revealed a different decade. Through her lens, she watched a 1950s family gather for dinner, their faces glowing with warmth from a long cold hearth. The mother served pot roast that steamed in the viewfinder, but left no smell in the present. The father's newspaper showed headlines about Eisenhower, crisp and readable in her preview screen. The living room shifted between eras like a temporal radio scanning through time. Here was a World War II victory celebration. There a silent era movie screening on a sheet turn screen. Each click of her shutter captured a different moment in the house's long memory. But it was the attic that changed everything. The stairs creaked beneath her feet like arthritic joints as she ascended. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight, forming patterns that seemed almost intentional, almost like words. The attic door stood slightly ajar, though the realtor had sworn it was locked. Through her camera's display, she saw tomorrow. There she was, Anna Martinez, trapped among the rafters as smoke billowed up from below. The timestamp on the photo read October 15th, 2025, exactly 24 hours from now. In the image, her future self pressed against a window that didn't exist in the present, flames reflecting in her terrified eyes. When she tried to leave, the front door opened into the kitchen. The back door led to the foyer. Every window showed a different year outside, but none showed 2025. The house had her, just as it had held on to its memories for all these years. In her panic, Anna began photographing everything, desperately searching for an escape route through time. That's when she noticed the pattern. Each photo showed a scene that had to happen before the next could exist. The 1920s tea party had left rings on the porch wood, visible in the 1950s family photos. The victory celebrations banner had been folded into a child's fort in the 1960s scene. The house wasn't just showing her its memories, it was showing her its story. And like any story, it needed to be told in the right order. With trembling fingers, Anna began to recreate each scene. She arranged teacups on the porch, where the 1920s socialites had sat. She placed a newspaper from the study on the kitchen table, exactly as the 1950s father had held it. Each recreation seemed to please the house. Doors that had led nowhere began to show proper rooms again. As midnight approached, she reached the final scene. The attic, her own future. Understanding dawned like a cold sun. The house wasn't trying to trap her in its past. It was warning her about its future. The demolition crew would arrive tomorrow, but something would go wrong. The old wiring, the dry wood, the decades of memories compressed into tinder. Anna ran. This time, the front door opened to 2025, to safety. She called the demolition company the moment she reached her car. When they checked the wiring the next day, they found exactly what the house had tried to tell her. a disaster waiting to happen. They demolished 1313 Sycamore Street safely the following week. Anna drove past as the dust settled, her camera heavy in her lap. When she reviewed her photos later, every single one had vanished except for a single image, the empty lot at sunset, where transparent figures from every decade stood together, waving goodbye. If you look closely at the photo, which now hangs in Anna's studio, you can see that each figure casts a shadow at a different angle, as if the sun is setting in multiple times simultaneously. Sometimes, late at night, Anna wonders about the house's final gift, that last photo. In it, she stands among the ghostly figures, though she never posed for such a shot. And in the windows of the transparent house behind them all, you can see scenes playing out eternally, tea parties and family dinners, victory celebrations and quiet moments, all happening at once in a place where time is not a line, but a house with many rooms, each one holding a story that needed to be told one last time. They say buildings absorb the memories of those who live in them. But sometimes, if you're very quiet and look through the right lens, you might find that memories can reach back through time to save those who know how to read them. Just be careful what you photograph. You never know when a house might want to show you its story or make you part of it. The night shift elevator. Let me tell you about something that happened at St. Mary's Hospital, where the fluorescent lights buzz like tired insects, and the night shift feels like stepping into another dimension, the kind of place where the squeak of nurses' shoes against freshly waxed floors echoes through corridors that seem to stretch endlessly into darkness. Sarah Coleman knew every inch of those halls, every shadow that danced across the mint green walls during her night shifts. 5 years of working from midnight to dawn had taught her the hospital's rhythm, the software of medical equipment, the distant murmur of late-night conversations, and the peculiar way sound traveled differently after sunset. The service elevator was as much a character as any person there, a hulking metal box with paint-chipped doors that shuddered like chattering teeth. When they closed, its buttons were worn smooth from decades of fingers pressing them, and it had a distinctive smell, a mixture of industrial cleaner, aged metal, and something else, something older, like yellowed pages in a forgotten book. That December night was different. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. The temperature had dropped so low that the windows were frosted with delicate patterns, turning each pane into nature's stained glass. Sarah's footsteps echoed differently, as if the sound was being swallowed by the thick winter air that hung in the corridors like heavy curtains. When she heard the elevator's ding, it wasn't the usual mechanical chime. This sound was deeper, more resonant, like a church bell underwater. The digital display flickered, not with its usual red LED glow, but with a warm, amber light that shouldn't have been possible on such modern equipment. And there it was, the number 7, burning like an ember in the darkness. The doors opened with a sound like a long, weary sigh. The modern interior she knew had vanished, replaced by something from another time. Rich wood paneling gleamed with the kind of polish you don't see anymore. Brass fixtures caught the light like liquid gold, and the floor was a mosaic of cream and burgundy, tiles arranged in patterns that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. The air inside smelled of witch hazel and carbolic soap, the sharp medicinal scents of a bygone era. As Sarah stepped in, her modern scrubs felt out of place against this backdrop of history. The temperature dropped several degrees, and her breath came out in visible puffs, dancing in the ancient light of tungsten bulbs. When the doors opened onto the 7th floor, it was like stepping into a sepia photograph come to life. The air was thick with the scent of starched uniforms and glass, syringes being boiled for sterilization. Nurses glided past like ghosts in their crisp white caps and perfectly pressed uniforms, their shadows seeming to move a fraction of a second after they did. And there, amid this living museum, stood her grandmother. She wasn't the elderly woman from the photos on Sarah's mantle, but young and vibrant, her auburn hair tucked neatly beneath her nurse's cap. Her eyes held the same warm brown color that Sarah saw in her own mirror every morning. And when she smiled, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Sarah, her grandmother's voice was like warm honey, familiar yet strange. I've been waiting 60 years to warn you. Her words carried the weight of decades, each syllable clear despite the strange acoustics of this impossible place. Tomorrow night, At 11:47 p.m., a fire will start in the west wing. The wiring. It's going to fail again. The sparks will start behind the walls of room 723, spread through the ancient insulation like hungry fingers. The next evening, when Sarah pulled that fire alarm at 11:45 p.m., her hands trembled, but her resolve was iron. 2 minutes later, as acrid smoke began seeping through the walls exactly where her grandmother had predicted, Sarah watched as 37 souls hurried to safety, their faces illuminated by the pulsing red emergency lights. They modernized everything after that: new wiring, new safety systems, even replaced the old elevator with a sleek, stainless steel model. But on quiet nights, when the moon hangs low and the hospital holds its breath, you might hear a phantom ding echoing through the halls. And if you're brave enough to look, you could catch a glimpse of two nurses, grandmother and granddaughter, sharing a knowing smile across the decades. Because sometimes, in places where life and death dance so closely together, time isn't a straight line, but a circle, endlessly turning like the floors of an elevator that stops at places that shouldn't exist. The Curator's Collection. Part 1. The Discovery. The Millbrook Historical Museum. Wasn't much to look at, just a converted Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, its paint peeling and shutters hanging crooked. As the new assistant curator, I was tasked with cataloging a recent donation, the personal collection of Dr. Eleanor Blackburn, a local anthropologist who'd spent 50 years studying Native American artifacts. The collection arrived in dozens of dusty boxes, each carefully labeled in Dr. Blackburn's spidery handwriting. Most contained typical items: arrowheads, pottery shards, beaded jewelry. But in the final box, wrapped in aging velvet, I found something different: a small clay figure, barely larger than my palm, shaped like a woman with her hands crossed over her chest. "That's the last piece Dr. Blackburn collected," said Martha, our elderly head curator. "She found it just before she disappeared." "Disappeared?" I asked, carefully turning the figure over. Strange symbols were etched into its base. 3 years ago, they found her car at the dig site, but no trace of her. The police assumed she'd fallen into one of the caverns, but they never found a body. Martha peered at the figure through her thick glasses. She was obsessed with that piece, said it was connected to something called the Dream Walkers. I placed the figure in our restoration room, planning to examine it properly the next day. That night, I dreamed of a woman in ancient clothing, her face painted with those same strange symbols, whispering words I couldn't understand. The Curator's Collection. Part 2. The Night Shift. The dreams continued for a week, each more vivid than the last. I started staying late at the museum, researching the figure's origins. The symbols matched no known Native American language, and the clay's composition was unlike anything local to the area. One evening, as sunset painted the museum windows blood red, I noticed something odd about the figure. It felt warm to the touch, despite sitting in our climate-controlled room all day. As I held it, the symbols began to glow with a faint, bluish light. The security system chose that moment to fail, plunging the museum into darkness. Emergency lights cast sickly green shadows across the display cases. In their glow, I could have sworn the figure's head had turned slightly, its blank eyes now staring directly at me. My phone rang, making me jump. It was Martha. "Whatever you do, don't let go of the figure," she said, her voice trembling. "I should have told you sooner. It's not just an artifact, it's a key." A key to what? The space between sleeping and waking. Dr. Blackburn found out too late. "They're coming now. They know you've activated it." The line went dead. In the silence, I heard footsteps in the hallway, light, barefoot steps approaching the restoration room. The Curator's Collection. Part 3. The Dreamwalkers. They entered like shadows, tall, impossibly thin figures with painted faces matching the clay figure's symbols. Their movements were fluid, as if they were underwater. 5 of them surrounded me, their dark eyes reflecting the emergency lights. "The key returns," one whispered, its voice like rustling leaves. "And a new keeper offers herself." "I don't understand," I said, clutching the figure tighter. "What are you?" "We are the guardians of the dream paths," another answered. "The spaces between worlds that humans glimpse in sleep. Each generation, we choose a keeper to maintain the boundary. Your predecessor grew too curious, ventured too far." An image flashed in my mind: Dr. Blackburn, walking the dream paths, seeing too much, slipping into a space from which there was no return. The choice is yours, the first dreamwalker said. Become the keeper, guard the key, maintain the boundary, or join your predecessor in the spaces between. The clay figure pulsed warmly in my hands, its glow intensifying. In its light, I saw the truth, glimpses of other worlds, layers of reality stacked like pages in a book, and the thin barriers keeping them separate. If I agree, I asked, what happens to me? You walk both worlds, guard both sides, keep the dreams from becoming real and reality from dissolving into dreams. I thought of Dr. Blackburn, her lifelong search for mysteries leading her too deep. I thought of my own dreams, growing stronger since touching the figure. Looking into the dream walker's eyes, I made my choice. Now I walk the halls of the Millbrook Museum each day, cataloging artifacts, giving tours, maintaining the appearance of normalcy. But at night, when the barriers thin, I walk different halls, paths between sleeping and waking, ensuring the doors between worlds remain closed. The clay figure sits in its display case, seemingly ordinary to visitors' eyes. Sometimes children stop and stare at it, as if sensing its true nature. I watch them carefully, looking for signs. After all, the dream walkers told me that one day, I too would need to choose a successor. Until then, I guard the boundaries, keeper of the key, walker of dreams. And if you visit our small museum and see a curator with strange symbols painted in shifting patterns on her skin, don't look too closely. Some doors are better left closed, and some dreams are better left unwalked. The end.